Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Sorry, I'm going to try to move this. And good morning. I can't quite follow the chat while presenting, so I'll check those questions later. So good morning, everyone. Today, Karen and I will be speaking about the Coastal Heritage at Risk Task Force, which is a partnerships and collaboration across many different groups. We'll show you all a list in a moment. Chart is very similar to Nahar, and we just sort of think of ourselves as nested under Nahar's mission, really. And we look at coastal heritage sites at risk from climate impacts. You can see some of our partners across the bottom of your screen: Florida State Parks, FPAN, of course, Seminole Tribe of Florida, University of Miami, and the National Museum of the Bahamas, the Antiquities, Monuments, and Museum Corporation. So today we're going to be, sorry, I can't read this because of all the things across my screen. So you'll have to read it to yourselves. Today we're going to be looking at narrative and story work from a decolonial perspective, which Karen's going to speak more about in a moment. But we wanted to start today's presentation off by looking at this quote, which is a combination of two different scholars' work, thinking about what it means to come from a place of power and an academic institution, an institution that's thought of by most groups as an imperial power in sort of this postmodern moment that we live in 2023. And how do we approach these stories as a place of social liberation that recognizes that we, though we are trained experts, come into these spaces putting our expertise to one side and asking the following questions. We take a decolonial approach that asks the following questions. We borrowed this slide from one of our lovely colleagues at the University of Miami, Scott and Evans. So whose interests are supported by our research? Who decides what questions get asked? Whose voices are privileged over others? Who has the power to legitimize a particular form of knowledge over others? So quick overview. Today, I'm going to be looking at who and what is the Coastal Heritage at Risk Task Force. I'll show you all a list of our stakeholders and partners. I'll give you a very brief overview of our mobile app. It's for the public, but it's also for 4th and 8th graders. A very brief, very brief, because today is not about our educational resources, but a very brief overview of the educational resources. And then I'm going to hand it off to Karen to speak more on the decolonial story work that we've been doing at Egmont Key. So the Coastal Heritage at Risk Task Force does have its own website. You can see at the bottom of the page here, if you would like to visit it. It's still a work in progress. It is our public-facing platform that we will be making available to public school teachers, particularly in Florida, but for anyone in the United States. As you all know, because you're here as a part of Nahar, that many sites, over 13,000, probably more than that, because these are just the recorded archaeological sites, are at risk from climate impacts. And what we're interested in at CHART are the unrecorded sites, the sites that do not make it to the master site file or are not part of the told histories of Florida. Many of these sites are Black American or African pre-American sites, Indigenous sites, and Cuban and Hispanic sites. So our partner list is fairly long. It's longer than could fit on this page, but for this first stage of chart, we worked with the following partners. These pictures on your right or on your left, on your right, I believe, are from a visit we made to the Bahamas. Our work on Bill Baggs State Park took us to the Bahamas as we traced the Saltwater Underground Railroad from Cape Florida to Andros Island in the Bahamas. And we look forward to future work and partnerships with the folks in the Bahamas. So this is the wireframe for the app. It's not yet live, but we're making it as simple as possible. The idea is our first 3 pilot sites Backe State Park, which is at the tip of Cape Florida, if you've never been there. So it's very much at the bottom of an island facing out towards the Bahamas. Backe is the site of the Saltwater Underground Railroad, which I'll show you more about in a moment. And this is an example of what each site will look like on the app. We're hoping to keep it incredibly user-friendly. And as school kids or the public visit from home, visit the site, they can click on short podcasts, which will include songs like the one you heard that started today off. And the podcasts will hopefully not deter too much from the fact that people are present at the site. So we're hoping that the way the podcast will work, or the way that we are recording it, is so that as people move through this space, or school children move through this space, they're able to look around as they listen to decolonial narratives. And there will be some pop-ups of video content and some historical still images also. So this is still in progress. We're almost done with, or we are nearly done actually, with the Egmont Key version. So we're also looking at Mullet Key, which, for those of you more familiar with the west coast of Florida, is just below Egmont Key. It is right out off of Fort DeSoto, which is frequented by tourists and public school field trips. There was a sustainable fishery trade between Florida and the Caribbean during periods of Spanish and British influence. It's another site that's flooding due to sea level rise, and it's a site that saw a lot of violence. We could use the word murder at this site by the U.S. Military campaigns from 1835 to 1842, and a lot of these Cuban fisher people lost their lives at this site. So we will be talking more about Egmont Key, which the Seminoles call our Auschwitz. It is a concentration camp. If you look below at the sort of animated map made by THPO, the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, you can see the dotted line shows the movement of people on a boat that basically removed as many Seminoles as possible. The U.S. military relocated people to the state that is now Texas and Oklahoma. This island is also a wildlife sanctuary, and it is slowly eroding. Well, it's actually quickly eroding due to sea level rise. We are fortunate that this story was already approved, had gone through many layers and levels of approval by the tribe as a public-facing story in PDF. This is just a quick overview of the type of materials we're making available from the PDF for public school kids. We'll be looking at how the island has so rapidly changed in terms of its shoreline and sea level rise. This is the PDF that's available online. If you search Egmont Key, A Seminole Story, you will quickly find this PDF, which has the entire story. It has the words to the song that you heard earlier, and it has the further story about Polly Parker and how she managed to escape what they call the death boat and walk all the way back. You can see the blue footprints all the way back down to Lake Okeechobee. So our final site, which we won't be speaking more about today, but we recently met with the Friends of Cape Florida to discuss their 200th anniversary, and it looks like we're going to be able to coordinate many different elements of our decolonial narrative into the 200th anniversary for Backe State Park's big celebration. It's a gorgeous lighthouse, and it's thought of as the oldest building in Miami. Unfortunately, though it brought light to colonial people living in South Florida, the light actually caused the Saltwater Underground Railroad to stop. So we think of the lighthouse in a bittersweet way in our own narratives. It is frequented by tourists. There are loads of tourists and school field trips. We just found out, in fact, that it makes over $3 million a year as a state park, and it doesn't have a very high entrance fee. It's something like $4 or $5. So that just, you can do the math there on how many people visit every year. It's already going underwater. There's sea life that clings to the interior of the lighthouse after flooding. And it's come to represent this space called Cape Florida that we have gone through the historical records to find more mention of the Saltwater Underground Railroad. And it even possesses an empty space where a Bohemian boat once stood, but has now eroded. And that's part of the 200th anniversary, is we're working to locate funds to repurchase or to purchase a new Bohemian boat to better provide interpretation space for talking about the Saltwater Underground Railroad. And now I will pass that off to Karen.
So thank you, everybody. As we transition between chart sites, there we go. As we transition between chart sites, here's a last look from the Bahamas. We witnessed this art installation under the coastal waters in Nassau. Storytelling takes many forms, and as we communicate our stories, our communities, and our connection to the world, deeply considering justice in storytelling calls us towards decolonial methodologies. Oops, there we go. As we move now back across the ocean from the Bahamas to Florida, as did the Bahamian fishermen who brought their boats to assist with the passage along the Saltwater Railroad, we transit across Florida, as the Indigenous peoples have done here for thousands of years, and pick up our next story on Florida's west coast at Egmont Key. Here we will explore story work in digital space and the process of engaging with communities and stories. Storytelling is a practice of holistic meaning making, and stories have a powerful effect on people, communities, and societies. This is particularly true of stories about who we are, where we are from, and what is understood to be the natural state of a space. As storytelling becomes increasingly pervasive in digital practice, it is critical that storytelling and story restoration research engage in decolonial methods and practice, center voices from the communities the stories are about, and reimagine the physical and digital heritage spaces to recognize and center restored stories as foundational. Today, we'll visit Egmont Key and discuss the planned chart reception study there. We'll look at decolonial narrative work, boundary object design principles, and recentering through digital story spaces. We'll draw connections across science and story as a practice unified in spirit and pursuit for building just outcomes. We begin here on the footpath walking across the island of Egmont Key. Egmont Key is a small island in Tampa Bay. It was used as an internment camp for the Seminole people during the United States military's campaign in Florida, called the Seminole Wars in state history texts, and known to the Seminole people as one continuous fight for survival. The island today is managed as a park and wildlife preserve by the state of Florida. Most of the physical remains of the Seminole story on the island are gone. The majority of the standing infrastructure here reflects the Civil War, and the majority of boaters and visitors come for beach recreation, looking to spot dolphins, turtles, seabird, and manatee. A blockhouse stood on the island. The U.S. Army sent raids into Florida to capture Seminole non-combatants, mostly women and children, and then sent a message to the warriors if they wanted to see their families again, they had to surrender themselves. After a long period of imprisonment, the steamship the Gray Cloud came to the dock and began a forced transportation west, where the Seminole tribe of Oklahoma lives today. Today, the place on the island where the blockhouse stood is a cracked helicopter pad, and the island is eroding into the ocean. However, not everyone was captured to the west. Polly Parker cleverly convinced her captors that she and some of the others were going to gather medicinal herbs. Her ruse worked, and they escaped. She led her group on foot, journeying across Florida to rejoin their families near Lake Okeechobee. Today, Polly Parker is considered a founding ancestor of the Seminole tribe of Florida. In less than the last century, Egmont Key has lost more than half its landmass, mostly due to sediment starvation from the dredging of Tampa Bay. This story of Egmont Key's past has been largely missing from the public view, and the Seminole Tribal Historic Preservation Office has engaged in great effort to preserve this history, along with the message that the Seminole people survived unconquered and are still here. There is a robust discussion among many stakeholders, including within the tribe, about whether efforts should focus on preserving the landmass of the island, how beach nourishment might disrupt wildlife like sea turtle nests, or should the island be reclaimed by the sea? However, everyone can agree that the story is worth saving. But how do you save a story? Power lies in stories, and decolonial approaches offer a methodology and toolkit in a political climate which grasps at power by seeking to codify historic erasures and cement borders of marginalization around dissenting voices and narratives. Telling and retelling these stories, centering the subaltern and celebrating the once marginalized, is not only powerful, but necessary. But what about the process? For Chart, we are approaching the process of story and collaboration differently at every site in response to the story keepers. At Egmont Key, we were lucky there was an existing narrative that had been produced and reviewed and approved for dissemination to the public by the tribe. So there was a ton of work they had already done we were building on. Even so, we, in using this story in a different format and space, were attentive to versioning approval. Refusal inherently asks to be defended, and consent is a living process. We checked in which version to use, maps, names, passages, and then rechecked, and found several layers of this process, really important notes on language, place names, what people wanted spaces and identities to be called, revealing over and over how language is context dependent across many layers. Timelines move and flexibility is key, and there's a need for recognition of this among grant funding agencies. Finding someone who is willing to give their literal voice to a project and working within their time is a process of building collaboration, relationship, and needs to be approached, valuing people at the forefront rather than the Academy's grids. Centering survivance and celebrating continuance is at the heart of story work. In reviewing decolonial practice, many efforts have focused on the narratives of loss of life, violence, and loss of culture. We find there's less work focused on understanding the courage, agency, and resilience of peoples and cultures. In 2009, Eve Tuck wrote, "In many ways, the underlying theory of change is borrowed from litigation discourse. It is a powerful idea to think of us all as litigators, putting the world on trial, but does it actually work? Do the material and political wins come through? And most importantly, are the wins worth the long-term costs of thinking of ourselves as damaged?" She recommends an epistemological shift to a desire framework, as desire, quote, accounts for the loss and despair, but also the hope, the visions, the wisdom of lived lives at communities. Desire is involved with the not yet, and at times, the not anymore. Story work is foundational as communities seek to suspend these damage-centered frameworks and move towards centering survivance and healing. This is a critical part of future-looking justice and works in tandem with demanding accountability. Practitioners, students, and teachers of story work as methodologies, particularly centering Indigenous peoples, African diaspora descendants, and other peoples whose experience includes significant historical trauma, focus on truth-telling and community healing practices. In 2020, Chioneso et al. Wrote that culturally syntonic story work functions as a tool for resisting oppression through processes that operate across dimensions of connectedness, collective memory, and critical consciousness, with justice-informed outcomes in each of these areas. In 2022, Gontarek and Harwood wrote, "Narrative alone cannot save us. We need the narrative glue, the alchemy, to make these connections as we hold a torch to the most productive scenes, navigating the biographical terrain of our lives as our politics come into their own. The big changes we need in society can be made to feel less challenging, more plausible, and achievable. This is what it takes to bring injustice to its knees, to keep ancestral voices alive by recording their wisdoms and traditions, and to build the foundations from which the future can speak to all of us." Researchers have often interacted with Indigenous knowledge in ways guided by a colonial framework, treating knowledge as an extractable resource to which a Western mythical collective society is entitled. Building collaboration in a history of broken promises requires entering into a meaningful shift of power. Efforts to aggregate Indigenous knowledge into a Western scientific process is a transactional framework, further delegitimized by the present lack of restorative justice. Institutions operating on stolen land cannot authentically engage in a fair transactional relationship with the sovereign Indigenous nations from whom the land was stolen. Contrary to the Western research claim that all knowledge is the purview of the Academy, making stories accessible to a broader public is not always a meaningful or positive outcome for communities of origin. Indigenous histories and knowledges, wrote Gontarek and Harwood in 2022, can be local and particular and bound by governance protocols, while resistant to popular imaginings. We cannot contain them for political research or narrative interests, for not all Indigenous knowledge is accessible in the ways required for Western discovery and innovation, or the demand of us increasingly as academics to present knowledge narratives as new. So instead of looking toward, researchers must stand with. Standing with also requires thinking about reciprocity and asking communities what they value, what they want from a process, really listening and thinking creatively about making institutional frameworks adapt. Meryl can tell you a story about accessing an audio recording of Billy Bowlegs as one act of reciprocity. The push to give back to communities has often engaged with research in a way imagined in an academic silo, and this has repositioned the researcher's position of authority. Instead, a framework of standing with positions the goal of inquiry as co-producing, situating knowledge in the context of community, and situating the practice of research allyship in generative refusal. Refusal itself is an agentive act, turning the gaze of the researcher toward the academy and asking critical questions regarding the desired and actual outcomes of the research. Refusal is among the many tools and challenges that arise in the pursuit of conducting just story work. Not all knowledge is public knowledge. In 2014, Tuck et al. Wrote, "To refuse settler sovereignty is to refuse the settler's unquestioned right to know and to resist the agenda to expand the knowledge territory of the settler colonial nation. Engaging in research refusal may entail knowing when a question shouldn't be asked, accepting a refusal to participate or reneging of participation from community members, even calling for an end to a project, engaging on timelines outside of academic recognition and funding cycles, and renegotiating obligations to publication standards and grant timeline projections. These are non-trivial obstacles to conducting ethical research while attempting to stay on a path of career growth and require commitment on the part of the researcher before engaging with community work. Boundary objects support understanding, stabilize ideas across spaces, and gain different types of legitimacy. Virtual environments can be tested, designed, and replicated, providing a space and story format that supports an iterative, collaborative design process. Successful boundary objects must attend to issues of equity, unequal power, inclusivity, and trust building. Digital access in heritage spaces is increasingly standard practice and expectation. Bringing critical gaze and theory to this work helps heritage professionals be careful not to replicate current structural inequities and injustices in these spaces and stories. Careful attention to the expansion of story work into digital spaces is necessary, lest existing problematic dominant narratives be repeated into the megaphone of the web and do harm louder. Doing this well supports the creation of storytelling, like these apps, serving in a boundary object space, providing a teaching tool and a learning tool, creating a safe intermediary for storytellers, allowing for storytelling at scale, and a support for those who want to learn and teach in justice-centered ways. Boundary objects which reinforce these messages may also serve as a second voice in the context of practice where minoritized people seeking to teach unheard perspectives, as Donovet described well in 2022, learn to, quote, go by twos, so if one voice is not heard, the other can defend, support, and be heard. Storytelling boundary objects can support teaching anti-oppression practices and learning to resist layered forms of oppression. The power of story transcends into digital spaces, which are far more flexible, editable, and scalable than static interpretation installations. Digital immersive heritage is inherently storied and inclusive of the experiential, recognizing soundscapes, seascapes, skyscapes, and landscapes as storied space. Standing in a space, listening to the birds and waves, seeing the color of the sky and the shape of the clouds is to gain an awareness of richly textured details missing from other forms of heritage communication. Building and working with digital platforms supports collaboratively adapting, which is foundational to building partnerships and keeping trust. It supports iterating a design process where everyone who is a project participant can review multiple steps along the way in a process of engaged design. Demands for cutting-edge technology is a form of digital gatekeeping itself, restricting storytellers in digital spaces to those only adept at coding. Research has shown in multiple contexts that audiences and participants far prefer good storytelling and engaging highly functional mechanics to the frustration of glitchy high-end graphic experiences or the flash of new technology, which also present issues of digital accessibility. App-based storytelling supports story work at scale, building a matrix of support to recenter stories that have been erased or pushed to the margins. This can take the form of highly accessible end-user platforms through partnerships built to collaboratively construct accessible storytelling to reach wider audiences. Heritage spaces are too often situated within a narrow and unacknowledged point of view. In doing so, these heritage experiences are shaped to be only welcoming in their narrative frames to people who see their culture as belonging to a people without story, blind to a colonized history and patriarchal white supremacist cultural norms. Decolonial approaches offer a framework to remediate these outcomes and reconstruct belongingness. All spaces are storied spaces, and all people bring stories with them to the spaces in which they participate. In decolonial approaches to heritage, technology is not an outcome, but a useful mechanism to broaden the reach of storytellers. Digital intervention in heritage storytelling are proliferating, and there remains a critical literature gap around reception and outcomes. Reception studies are a key way to understand experiences of place. Our study design is focused on an affective experience of Egmont, particularly senses of connection, perception, and value with virtual and in-person visitors, examining how attitudes change after narrative engagement. We will engage visitors to Egmont to further understand their experience across different types of visits. Participants in the public survey will complete before and after surveys. Group A experiencing the storytelling app remotely, Group B the storytelling app during their visit to the island, and Group C visiting the island in person without the app. We hope to understand best practices for decolonial public heritage interpretation. The TIPO also plans to hold a roundtable discussion about the app and include tribal members' reflections to put on record what the tribal community members want published about their space and their experience. Attentive to the intention of our research gaze, we will not be coding or analyzing tribal member stories. We have provisional TIPO approval to include these reflections for context, included whole, along with our analysis of the public survey results. Digital spaces offer a format for recentering narratives. Walking in the place where people have walked before is a powerful experience. Listening to their stories in these spaces, whether physically or virtually immersed there, grounds and connects the story receiver to place. By studying public responses, we seek to broaden the reach of recentered stories, safer narrative teaching tools, and improve reception of restored stories. While we are studying public responses, this app is designed for presentation in Florida school trips, offering a boundary object support to teachers who are creatively seeking ways to engage in decolonial praxis and history education. Restorative story work can restore heritage spaces as foundational community spaces, dispelling what Adichie in 2009 called the danger of a single story. As Mendoza and Kinifuchi wrote in 2016, modern Western culture tends to abstract concrete human beings into autonomous individuals, dissociated from all that makes up the thickly storied self. This typically includes alienation from the past, ancestry and history, place, land, and nature, memory and imagination, dreams, instinct, unconscious parts of self, mythic origins, collective storytelling, rites of passage, embodied communal celebrations, and simply from a sense of awe, wonder, and mystery. Restoration of these relationships and relational values makes room for a holistic climate adaptation, planning, and response. Centering community-led, research-supported practices is a principal action for balancing rights and responsibilities and lies at the heart of equitable climate change response. Climate responses are deeply connected to the fabric of storytelling that impact people, power, resources, and belonging. Understanding the histories at work in coastal spaces requires looking across landscapes and seascapes in time, outside of the boundaries drawn by powers of historic colonial control and modern state narratives. In this view, oceans become places that connect rather than divide. Time draws fluid connection between people and place, memory and story, that we now remember as fluid and living. These often interdisciplinary approaches draw across fields and are growing in practice as researchers work to develop, uplift, and recognize the importance of critical theory-grounded methodologies, which challenge social norms and refute the histories that stabilize unjust systems of power. This approach allows us to confront the Western-imposed notion of nature and culture as separate, restore the connectivity and relationships-based approach to landscapes, history, memory, people, and place. Naming and rebalancing these relationships hold space for epistemologies that center relationships and relational values. Science is a deeply storied construct. The work of science itself is discursive storytelling practice, from the stories we tell through our data to the stories we tell our colleagues and funders about our work, and the stories we tell about ourselves, and how we came to identify as research professionals and why we engage in the work we pursue. By bringing heritage and story work into our notion and construction of science, we push back on the boundaries of STEM and make space for heritage and story. Approaching research as culturally diverse and storied makes space for the social and environmental justice intersections with climate change. This is a necessary support for developing locally meaningful and culturally appropriate climate adaptation and response. With that, any thoughts or comments, please feel free to reach me. Here's my email, and thank you so much for joining us today.